This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. And welcome back, everybody, to this, our first episode of Books for Breakfast 2021. A new year, new books, new discussions, and of course, new toaster challenges. I'm really looking forward to it. Are you, Peter?
I am indeed, Enda, yeah.
Well, I'm really looking forward today to hearing Peter interview Philip Coleman. He co-edited with Calista McRae the selected letters of the American poet John Berryman, and it's been published by Harvard University Press. So that's going to be great to hear.
And Enda's going to be doing a roundup of some of her choices for the new year, books published this year, and some new books, some debuts and books from seasoned authors.
So the coffee's made.
The toast is on.
And the books are on the table.
So Enda, where do you start?
Exactly. Where do you start? There are so many books. We're all being told to lock down, to stay at home. We certainly won't be bored if we reach to our shelves and pull down some of these books. New year, new books, debuts, as you said, books from seasoned authors. So I'll just give a quick roundup. First of all, I would like to give a shout out to a new series on RTÉ Radio 1. It's called Spoken Stories Independence. It's a collection of 12 stories where authors write about what independence means to them. And Anne Enright has set the series off. Some of you may have heard her. It'll take place on Sundays at 7 p.m. Anything, I think, which promotes Irish writing is fantastic. And this series will roll on until Easter, and it's produced by Cliona Neonlún. So that sounds great, doesn't it, Peter?
Yeah, that sounds great. Great for anybody interested in stories. But I know you've got novels you want to talk to us about too, haven't you?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been waiting for a long time for a new novel from Claire Keegan. Her work is absolutely spectacular. Her last novella, Foster, came out, I think it must be about 10 years ago, but her publishers are saying that this book, which is coming out in October of 2021, Small Things Like These, will be absolutely exquisite. It's a wintry parable. It's a long way to return from her, and it's supposed to be a story of simple courage and tenderness. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and you also, indeed, as am I, but you also mentioned debut novelists.
That's right. Well, I don't really know if I can call Danielle McLaughlin a debut novelist. She is well known for her short stories. I absolutely loved her collection, Dinosaurs on Other Planets. She took up writing when she was 40 because she got sick and she stopped practicing as a solicitor and she began to write, and she won loads of prizes, the Sunday Times Short Story Award, the Wyndham Campbell Prize. I know you don't write for prizes, but it is interesting how she immediately achieved such a high standard. Her stories have appeared in The New Yorker. But this is her first novel, and I am, again, really looking forward to it. It tells the story of an art curator, Nessa McCormack. She's beginning to get her career off the ground and her marriage back on track. But her husband has had an affair, and then the past crawls up and threatens to ruin everything. So it sounds like a very good read. She's a quiet writer, but she's a very, I think, astute writer, so I'm looking forward to that. Una Mannion is going to be bringing out a debut book as well called A Crooked Tree, and that comes from Faber, and it's a haunting, suspenseful debut. It's a moment of rage. A mother pulls over her car and she tells her 12-year-old daughter to get out, and then she drives away. I'm sure many of us can feel that enraged sometimes, but she actually takes her rage into a form of a very strange action, leaves her daughter there, and it's supposed to be a devastating journey through family life. It's set in suburban 80s in America, so looking forward to that as well. And then there's the book Words to Shape My Name by Laura McKenna. It's coming out with New Island. It's a debut. I'm really interested in this book. It's a historical novel, I suppose. It takes place in 1857. It's a young woman named Harriet Small. She's bequeathed her father's true narrative, and it's an account of life after escaping slavery in South Carolina, and then it takes them on a journey into revolutionary Ireland, and it includes figures most prominently of which is Lord Edward Fitzgerald. So I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. I'm kind of jealous of that book, actually, because I kind of feel that I should have written it with my namesake Major Sirr arresting Lord Edward Fitzgerald and all of that. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's right, because Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Major Sirr are buried side by side, isn't that right, in St. Werburgh's
They are indeed.
church.
I really should have written this, but I was.
You should have written it, but too late, Laura McKenna.
And of course, just to say, she will be featuring on Books for Breakfast later on, so people might keep an ear out and maybe even eyes out for that.
Yeah, well, I hope she does. I hope she will come on. That would be fantastic. Also, I really, as I've said earlier, love short stories, and this is a debut collection, this next one of short stories. It's called Pure Gold by John Patrick McHugh, coming out again from New Ireland. A really fine collection of short stories. And actually, it's interesting because those of you who loved Sally Rooney's Conversation with Friends, if you look through this book at the acknowledgements, you can see that she gives a big shout out to him. He's supposed to be a very astute editor as well. He's also appeared in Granta, Winter Papers and The Stinging Fly. And I think this is a writer who really knows what he's about. Debut novelist who I think we'll be hearing a lot more of. So that's Pure Gold by John Patrick McHugh, published by New Ireland. And then also Louise Nealon, she's a Kildare woman. She came to attention when she won the Sean O'Phelan Prize in 2017 with her story, What Feminism Is. And her debut, Snowflake, has caused quite a bit of fuss. It got actually a 6-figure deal with Bonnier, and she was taken on by the agent Marion Gunn O'Connor. But the story, which will come out this year, it's a novel. It tells the story of 18-year-old Debbie. She lives on a dairy farm in Kildare with her mother and her uncle, who lives in a caravan. The uncle seems to have lost all sense of hope. His dreams haven't come to fruition. He's drinking a lot. And then she moves on to Trinity. And I suppose it's a novel for a young generation. And it's about a young girl maturing into adulthood. So that could be one to watch out for as well.
Indeed. 6-figure deal. That's almost as much as I got for my last book of poems.
Now, so will we move on, Peter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So what have you got next?
Well, actually, I mean, the next writer, we both know him. He started off as a poet. His name is Conor O'Callaghan. He's got a second novel coming out from Doubleday, so fair play to Conor. It's called We Are Not in the World. His previous novel was called Nothing on Earth. And actually, it received an awful lot of praise, especially I remember from Eileen Battersby, who was really astounded by it. And she said it was a hugely fine piece of work. But his new novel is about displacement, exile. It's about a father-daughter relationship. It's at the heart of this book, and it takes place on a haulage lorry moving through France. So that sounds very interesting as well.
That does sound good, yeah. And I'm looking. I'm really. I have to say, because your next choice, I'm actually really looking forward to reading as well, because.
Okay, well, would you like to tell us about it then, Peter?
It's just that I know. I think he's a very interesting writer. Because I keep meaning to read his. He wrote a book sort of based around Ted Hughes and Crow, and Grief is a Thing with Feathers. You know, it's like that's on my list to read this year. And so this one, The Death of Francis Bacon, sounds very intriguing. Do you want to tell us about it?
Well, you've actually said it there. The author is Max Porter, and she's a really fine writer. And as you said, he's the author of Grief is the Thing with Feathers and Lanny, a series of 7 extraordinary written pictures. And this book imagines the artist Francis Bacon's deathbed musings. So it's a very original idea, I think, for a book. It's a small book, but they're saying that it's going to be one of the biggest titles of 2021. So that's interesting. And
he's in Madrid. He's dying in Madrid as well. Surrounded. He's in a hospital and he doesn't speak any Spanish, and it's kind of intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of adds to the complexity of the story, doesn't it? So yeah, I think it's a very imaginative idea. For anybody who loves thrillers as well, I'd like to give a shout out to Sam Blake's The Dark Room. She's a best-selling author. Some of you might know her from writing.ie. She does absolutely astounding work promoting literature in Ireland, I think. Her real name is Vanessa Fox O'Loughlin. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to reveal that, but I'm sure many of you know. And this novel is set in a house full of mystery in West Cork, and it centres around 2 women and their intertwined investigations. And she is very masterful, I think, thriller writer. So I'm looking forward to that. Then Billy O'Callaghan, John Banville chose this book, Life Sentences, as one of his favourite books coming out this year. It's based on true stories told by Billy O'Callaghan. He's a Cork writer, told by his parents and grandparents. And it begins with a woman leaving her island in the aftermath of the famine. And then it moves through 3 generations of war and violence and love. He's a very, very good writer, very good short story writer too. So I'm looking forward to this. And then if anybody is interested in James Joyce and the love story between himself and his Mrs. Nora, I think I have to mention Nuala O'Connor's New Island. It's coming out with New Island. It's called Nora, a love story of Nora and James Joyce. And it's a fictionalised account of this story. And it's told from the perspective of Nora Barnacle. So that could be a good one to read as well.
Right. There's a few coming from writers kind of returning to the scene after a few years' absence. Isn't that right?
That's right. Well, Peter, I know that you're a fan of Kevin Power's writing. He's a very good writer. His debut novel, which came out in 2008, Bad Day in Black Rock, was loosely based on the death of Brian Murphy in Dublin in 2000. And it was made into that film, that brilliant film, What Richard Did, directed by Lenny Abramson. That was a great film, wasn't it, Peter?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, but I mean, it is interesting that Kevin Power hasn't published a novel since that debut. I mean, I know he's worked as a critic. I've seen lots of his articles. He works in Trinity College too, teaching on the MPhil in creative writing. But this is great that he's got a new novel coming out. The only son of a rich South Dublin banker is abruptly cut off from his privileged lifestyle when his father is arrested. So it's a tale of drugs, dead-end jobs, school friends come in, shady property deals in the Balkans. Something is going on, and I just really want to read this book. It'll be great. And also Keith Ridgway. I mean, Keith Ridgway is such a great writer as well, and it's almost 10 years since his last book, Hawthorne and Child, came out, and he published 5 others before that. So he's a very prolific writer,
right.
but I think it's great to see these kind of writers coming back to the fore again. And he had said, I remember reading somewhere, he said that he was going to turn his back completely on fiction. So that would have been such a pity. And I'm really greatly delighted that his new novel, A Shock, is due for release in July of 2021. And just as a kind of a strange idea for a book, but I think it's very compelling and interesting, we featured Zadie Smith's essays on the podcast back in 2020, but this book is called Weirdo, and Zadie Smith and her husband and writer and poet Nick Laird have come together for Puffin, and it's a picture book collaborated by the two of them about a guinea pig who wears a judo suit and not an outfit which not everyone understands or approves of. So it sounds like a bit of fun, doesn't it? That sounds good.
That does sound good. Yeah.
Maybe we could try and do something like that, Peter. Do you like judo?
Yeah. I do. I love judo, yeah. And I think, I mean, that's kind of what we have time for at the moment, because I know there's lots of poetry books that come out as well, and I think we want to do justice to those, and maybe we'll give those a slot in our next program, because there's lots of stuff that came out in 2020 and lots of stuff that's going to come out this year.
That's right. Yeah, there are an awful lot of good poetry books. Yeah. What about, we can chat about that at another stage, Peter.
We'll give those on the next podcast. We'll give those a kind of proper mention. So thanks for that, and just to say, obviously, as always, the full list of all of these books will be on the website on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. So check those out and have a look at some of those titles. It's going to be a busy reading year this year as well, because I imagine a lot of books that were planned for last year and were delayed by the unmentionable will be coming out this year. So it'll be a crowded year for books, I'd say.
Yeah, crowded but energetic, and it's going to be exciting.
Great. Okay. So thanks for that, Enda.
Number 14. I generally only publish in serious magazines here and abroad, but something led me once, a friendship with the editor, to send this to a thing called Harper's Magazine. Perhaps you have heard of it. Well, they published it, of course, and later on, they wrote back to me that it was the only point they had ever published that it elicited any correspondence. And meanwhile, I was getting bitter letters from people all over the United States, parodies of it. Oh, the readers of Harper's Magazine, ladies and gentlemen, we really mustn't go into such subjects. It goes, life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. After all, the sky flashes, the great sea yearns, we ourselves flash and yearn, and moreover, my mother told me as a boy, repeatedly, ever to confess you're bored means you have no inner resources. I conclude now I have no inner resources because I am heavy bored. Peoples bore me. Literature bores me, especially great literature. Henry bores me with his plights and gripes, as bad as Achilles, which is spelt with a small a. Who loves peoples and valiant art, which bores me. And the tranquil hills and gin look like a drag. And somehow a dog has taken itself and its tail considerably away into mountains or a sea or a sky, leaving behind me. Wag.
That was a rare recording of John Berryman reading Dream Song number 14, and it's by way of introduction to this week's Toaster Challenge guest, Dr. Philip Coleman, Associate Professor in the English Department of Trinity College, Dublin. Philip has been teaching in the English Department since 2003, where he completed a PhD thesis on the poetry of John Berryman in 2001. In 2015, he was made a Fellow of Trinity College and currently serves as Junior Dean and Registrar of Chambers in college. His research to date has focused mainly on US American poetry and contemporary short fiction, but he's had a special interest in the poetry of John Berryman since the 1990s. And in addition to several essays and articles on Berryman, he's also published John Berryman's Public Vision, Relocating the Scene of Disorder, 2014, Berryman's Fate, a Centenary Celebration in Verse, 2014, John Berryman Centenary Essays, co-edited with Peter Campion, 2017, and After 30 Falls, New Essays on John Berryman, co-edited with Philip McGowan in 2007. And just this year, the culmination, if you like, of his research on Berryman to date is the Selected Letters of John Berryman, co-edited with Calliston McRae and published by Harvard University Press in 2020. So, Philip, you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast.
Cheers, Peter. Great to be here.
First of all, Philip, Junior Dean, does that mean are you the person who has to give out to the students if they blot their copybooks?
Well, yes and no. I am the college officer who oversees student discipline, so I'm usually not looking at when they've blotted their copybooks, but when they get into other kinds of bother, climbing over the walls and having parties without permission, that kind of thing. Yes.
Oh, that sounds scary. Okay.
Scary for them.
Scary for them. Okay. Let me start with an obvious question. I mean, to be clear to anyone from that introduction that I just gave you, I mean, John Berryman has been in your life, for a great deal of your adult life. So what's the attraction? Why John Berryman?
Yeah, you'd imagine, Peter, in fact, when you were doing the roll call of publications and so on, that I've had enough of him at this point. I was introduced to the poetry of John Berryman in UCC in the 1990s. I was really fortunate there to have some great teachers of American literature, Lee Jenkins, and a guy called Ron Callan, who's now retired. He taught at UCD after his post in UCC, published a wonderful book on Williams in the 90s. But Ron introduced me, William Carlos Williams and Transcendentalism. Ron introduced me to the poetry of John Berryman. I had a seminar with Ron where part of it was focusing on 77 dream songs. And I blame him partly for my own kind of fascination, obsession, I suppose, really, with Berryman. But it was initially, I suppose, the realization that this, a great American poet was obsessed equally with W.B. Yeats. It was actually the Yeats connection that drew me in initially. And that Dream Song 312, I remember reading it because I, as an Irish student of literature, and in fact, at that point in my career, in my studies, I was, more interested in Irish poetry in English than in American. And so Ron developed this kind of encouraged this interest. And I remember reading Dream Song 312, which begins, "I have moved to Dublin to have it out with you, majestic shade." I remember thinking just, well, like, what a great opening to Dream Song. And I thought, well, in what way was Berryman seeking to have it out with Yeats? And in what way was Yeats a majestic shade to this American poet who seemed to be so original and idiosyncratic, completely to have his own voice, his own approach to form, and for him to turn to a figure like Yeats quite late on in his career to have it out. That for me became a kind of a critical question, a scholarly question, which drove a lot of my earlier work on him.
Because he was a fantastic scholar as well. I mean, as a poet, I mean, one thing that comes out in the letters as well. I mean, he's fantastically learned. He's deeply interested in Shakespeare and Yeats and Dante, and he's teaching all over. He's teaching everything practically. So he's an enormously learned man.
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, the story of Berryman as a scholar goes hand in hand with the story of his development as a poet. In one of the later letters to Mark Van Doren, who was one of his teachers at Columbia in the 30s, he describes himself as Dr. Dry as Dust. He says, "That's me, Mark," explaining the fact that the work on Shakespeare, which was a lifelong pursuit for him, was ongoing and that he intended to complete it. His essays on Shakespeare, by the way, especially one called Shakespeare at 30, is just a remarkable piece of scholarly writing. And throughout the 1940s in particular, he was working on what could have been the greatest critical edition of King Lear in the 20th century, but Berryman was beaten to the post by a Cambridge-based scholar called W.W. Gregg. It's interesting that you began this chat with Dream Song 14, because of course in that Dream Song too, you get a sense of Berryman the poet playing with language, with form, kind of teasing us in very interesting ways with images, but of course also kind of playing with his own persona as a scholar, talking about great literatures boring him and so on, and the allusion. So he's a very, very learned poet. The scholarship kind of spills over into the poetry at times. I think the poetic kind of interest in things is also there in the scholarship.
We've been chatting about the Dream Songs, and we've mentioned a couple. I mean, to me, it seems self-evident that the Dream Songs, particularly I suppose the first 77 that were published as a group, is one of the high points of poetry in the 20th century. I mean, I saw that Henry Cole had written memorably about what he called their strange combination of decorum and distress, and their volatile mix of tenderness and unease, and that seemed to me to get it. Is it for you? I mean, is that the high point for you? Because there's a lot of other Berrymen as well. I took down his collected poems the other day, and they're the collected poems besides the Dream Songs, and that's a chunky. That's book.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would say that for most readers, and indeed for myself, the Dream Songs is the high point. I mean, I suppose we shouldn't forget that Berryman, started working on this long poem that became the Dream Songs quite early on. As early as the late 40s, he had been playing around with a stanza form that would become the Dream Song, kind of, 3-6-line stanza form. Yeah.
3 6s,
so he'd been playing around with that from the 1940s in the Nervous Songs, which are in his first book, his first major book, I suppose, The Dispossessed, which was published in 1948. Many critics, and I think Berryman himself, thought that Homage to Mistress Bradstreet was his breakthrough poem, published in 1953. Again, a remarkable poem in the way that it kind of engages with this fairly minor figure in some ways in American literary history, a poet who, Anne Bradstreet, a poet whom Berryman didn't particularly admire her poetry, but it was the personality and the experience of, of those New Englanders in the 17th century that really, I think, attracted him. But yeah, I think when 77 Dream Songs was published in 1964, it wasn't that Berryman had suddenly the year before hit upon this idea and, published this book. I mean, the book was a long time in the making, and it does represent a high point. And he then went on, as you know, to publish His Toy, His Dream, His Rest in 1969, and then the Dream Songs in 1969. Also, and I think rightly for many readers, and possibly even for the poet himself, it was the centre of his achievement. He went on to publish a couple of more books before his death in 1972, but I think he himself kind of struggled with, the movement away, the attempt to make something different. Yeah.
It's a thing you notice, and he notices it with Lowell as well. I mean, in that reputations, I mean, he had a very high reputation, obviously, in his own lifetime, as did Lowell, and the Dream songs were greeted quite ecstatically by most critics of the time. But they often shift reputations after the death of an author, and I'm wondering, where does Berryman stand today? And I suppose, part of the reason I'm asking that is because, for instance, in that reading at Ohio where where we started, when he's introducing the Dream songs, he says explicitly, it's about a character called Henry, a fictional character in blackface who has suffered an irreversible loss. And I think for some reason, or for some readers, that blackface doesn't seem to sit well. It makes people uneasy.
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. I don't think blackface sat easily or well with Berryman either, I'll say. I mean, I think that for Berryman, it was a challenge to actually use that mask and to ventriloquize in that way, as earlier kind of 20th century American writers had done, so he's participating in a tradition of racial ventriloquism that we can see in Gertrude Stein, for example, in Melanchthon, that we can see in the exchange between, say, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, Old Possum. You can see it throughout 20th century US American culture. And so Berryman didn't take it for granted. And I think he knew he was doing something incredibly risky when he did this. And I think this was part of the kind of aesthetic challenge that he set himself. But I would see it also as part of the kind of cultural challenge that he set himself as a poet who was a public figure, not just in terms of giving readings and being the kind of celebrity poet of the late 60s. But let's not forget also that, going back to your earlier point, Peter, about Berryman as a scholar. I mean, he was a university professor. He was a Regents professor at the University of Minnesota from the early 60s until his death. So he knew that he was a kind of a public figure, and he was, I think, addressing in a very direct way serious problems of his time, of the 1960s, of the civil rights movement and so on. So that's the context within which I see it. And the way in which the work then kind of fell out of favor in the 70s and even into the 80s, 90s, you could say, I don't think it has so much to do with that, actually. I think really what it has to do with, in terms of Berryman's reception, is more of a kind of a backlash against confessionalism. And I think that, Berryman wasn't the only poet of his generation, and especially those who are often described as confessional. He wasn't the only one to be kind of sidelined in critical debates through the 70s and 80s, when the kind of private, intimate, personal disclosures that you find, say, in Anne Sexton or Robert Lowell or even Sylvia Plath go somewhat, they become, I think, unpopular, and they're kind of overtaken in the critical discourse really by a different kind of poetry. I'm thinking, say, of the rise in critical significance of, say, the language poetry, or the kind of other schools and movements. So I think, quite rightly, at this moment in time, in the context of, say, Black Lives Matter movement since 2013 and so on, readers, scholars, critics are looking again at Berryman and asking, well, hang on a minute, what's actually going on here when he uses blackface?
Yeah.
And I think they're beginning to appreciate the kind of difficult provocations of the poetry in this regard. And so I think he was very much aware of those. It's really interesting for me to see not only, this kind of question being taken up by critics, but by poets. So Claudia Rankine, for example, in Citizen, quotes Berryman at one point, and kind of reminding us that the work of art is there. It's part of the so-called canon. So what are we going to make of it, and how are we going to reinterpret it for a new time, for a new generation of readers?
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, just to get onto the letters, Philip, because that's part of our purpose, I suppose, in being here. And I mean, in a way, it's a funny thing to be talking about a writer's letters, because it almost seems at this remove like a Victorian practice, and it's hard to imagine any. Do you know what I mean? It's hard to imagine any writer now leaving behind 700 pages of letters, and is it going to be the collected tweets of, or the collected Facebook postings of, whoever. And first of all, it's a big book. What kind of a job was it just to gather these letters?
Yeah, well, Peter, you're absolutely right. And I've got to tell you, so the book is approximately 250,000 words in length. That includes the letters, the footnotes, or actually the endnotes, the index, and the introduction. And that apparatus is fairly, minimalist, because we wanted to include as many letters as possible. But Callista and I had to exclude about 120,000 words worth of letters, which we had transcribed, but we simply couldn't fit in this volume because it is a selected letters. And the task of putting the book together, was carried out over many years. I suppose it gathered pace really over the last 5 years since Callista and I started working together on it. Trying to track letters from Berryman to a wide range of writers. I mean, there's about 200 different correspondence included in the book, about 600 letters to about 200 different people. And they are scattered across the United States in many different archives, libraries. And also on this side of the Atlantic, there are a couple of letters from Berryman in the Trinity College Library, for example, to Brian Boydell, and in UCD's archive to Jack Sweeney, the great, patron of the arts and art collector.
Because one of the things that strikes me, just reading the letters as well, is that it's like a portrait of his age. Because these are letters to, all the giant figures. It's like, Mark Van Doren, Alan Tate, R.P. Blackmore, Clance Brooks, obviously the publishers, but there's Louis MacNeice. He writes to Eliot, and there's a memorable, correspondence with Saul Bellow. So it's extraordinary kind of that sense of him being at the thick of the culture of his time.
That's right, Peter. And for me, that's one of the most important things about this book. The fact that it does reinforce this sense of Berryman as a writer who was engaged in his culture, who was participating in the big debates of his time in terms of poetry's place in the world, in the United States, and responding to other writers' work, not just poets. Some wonderful letters, for example, to Delmore Schwartz, also to the little-known poet of the 1940s who only published one book and was a great friend of Berryman's, Bain Campbell. But as you say, also to Saul Bellow. And, to go back to your earlier question, there is something of the kind of aspirin papers about this. When you're putting a book like this together, you kind of feel maybe a little bit uneasy about putting out into the world things that might have been intended as kind of private documents simply between two people. And of course, one thinks of, say, Thomas Hardy insisting that all of the letters go in a bonfire, or even Philip Larkin more recently, But ultimately, we had to make a call about, these letters and, what their value actually is. And I think they do have that value, as you've said, in terms of, helping us to appreciate in new ways Berryman's relationships with individual writers who, people might read this book if they're interested in Bellow, say, or if they're interested in MacNeice, but they might also, I think, get a new version of Berryman here. It's as if, in a way, it's a kind of almost like a kind of autobiography. Berryman telling his story, his journey as a writer in his own words through the letters.
On the human level, you get a sense of the sheer difficulties that there's the sheer workload that he's under a lot of the time. He's going from college to college. He's kind of all around the place. He's teaching huge amounts of students. He's beset constantly with money worries, and a very large amount of letters seem to be about money and where is my check. And you said the check was in the post and I haven't got it, and I've been on to the embassy and I've been on to the and so very fraught kind of life as well.
Absolutely, Peter. From the very beginning of his career, there is this anxiety about personal circumstances, material circumstances often. The first letter in the book, I think, is heartbreaking. He's at boarding school. He writes back and says to his parents, "I love you too much to talk about." It's really, you're absolutely right. I think from the very beginning that kind of sense of distance and estrangement is there, but absolutely as well in material terms throughout his career, moving from job to job, kind of making a case for higher pay, chasing up editors for payment for poems and essays. It exists throughout. And later on, with various prizes, the Pulitzer and the National Book Award and so on, he does become a little bit more comfortable, but of course he has responsibilities. And I think there's often this, when people look at the kind of YouTube videos of Berryman reading and they see him in Jack Ryan's In Ball's Bridge, for example, and think of him as this boozy poet, and they might be inclined to think, well, this guy didn't have a kind of care in the world, he's kind of off doing his own thing. But actually the letters show that he's somebody who's constantly worrying about, how is his mother doing? Does she have enough money? Thinking about his son Paul, who's, living on the other side of the country with his second wife Anne, making the alimony payments, fulfilling those obligations. So the letters do speak to that really human aspect of the poet's life, and how difficult it could be often for him to make ends meet.
Indeed. And Philip, tell us a bit about, because obviously people mightn't be aware of this, but he came to Dublin and he lived in Bowles Bridge, and that was an important part of his life. Can you just tell us something about that?
He did. Well, he came to Dublin twice, Peter. He first visited Dublin in 1937 in an attempt to locate and meet with W.B. Yeats. It didn't happen. When he got to Dublin in that year, I think Yeats's wife told him that actually W.B. is in London. So he went back to London and did meet him there. And the record of that meeting with Yeats is in a wonderful book of letters to Berryman's mother, edited by Richard Kelly, which came out in 1988. But in this book, which I've edited, we have many other letters from a longer period of time Berryman spent in Dublin in the 60s, specifically from September 66 until May 67. And so you've got, this was a trip which was funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship. And it's where he effectively, finished work on the Dream Songs, prepared Berryman's sonnets for publication. During his time here, he became very friendly with a number of the kind of literary figures here. He knew Liam Miller, for example, John Montague, the young Richard Ryan, was around. And he also, which I discovered a number of years ago, he was very friendly with Ronnie Drew of the Dubliners during his time here. So he lived in Bowles Bridge. I think Jack Ryan's in Beggar's Bush was kind of like his office in a way,
Did he ever meet Kavanagh?
He attended the famous reading in Liberty Hall, was it? Where, Kavanagh stormed out. In fact, Berryman was giving the reading. Berryman gave a reading, and which I think was organised by John Montague. And Kavanagh, I believe, agreed to attend the reading and stormed off. And there's this story is well known. Did he ever meet him? I'm sure he did, but he doesn't. If he did, Kavanagh didn't make such a great impression. Austin Clarke is mentioned in one of the Dream Songs also. And I remember a couple of years ago visiting Berryman's personal library, and I didn't find any Kavanagh there, but he did have books by Thomas Kinsella. And also he had, which was really interesting to me, he had a copy of Clarke's Mnemosyne Lay in Dust in his library.
And of course, MacNeice was a friend, and he knew Dennis Devlin as well, I think, or he was certainly aware of him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he got to know Devlin in the 50s through Alan Tate. Of course, Tate was so important in Devlin's, kind of career. MacNeice through London again in the late 30s, where he met MacNeice along with Dylan Thomas.
Philip, you have a letter, one of his letters that you were going to treat us to.
Sure. I mean, there are so many, right? So it's kind of difficult to choose. I chose this one, Peter, because I suppose it's one of the Dublin letters, the later Dublin letters. It's nice to see the address, 55 Lansdowne Park, Bowes Bridge, at the top of the letter, where you can still, walk down that lane there and see the house where he lived. I chose this one because it takes the form of a dream song, so it's an unpublished dream song, kind of hidden away until now among the letters. So I thought I'd read this. So it's to his friend and publisher, Robert Giroux. Dear Bob, old friend, he swore, I have sent you one of my 14 unpublished books, and you have not replied. Now that was not well done. If it comes to a decision, spring to my side. Damn the trustees, down with business meetings, up the adventure of art. Which we were born for. Now so long ago, your poem about Proust still sticks in my head, and your good-humoured editing. Between us, we ran the place, a small place, Columbia, but worth the running. Our first scene. Now that was long ago, but I remember later scenes, too grand, our weddings, when you would have had my hand, but you were in the Pacific, on the Essex. So Mark did, in the Lady Chapel at St. Patrick's, in Naval Air Intelligence you were, concerned with winning a different war. Ever, John. I love that, Peter. I have to say, there's so much going on in it. I think the phrase "up the adventure of art" should possibly be put on the doorways to so many places, but also just recollecting his undergraduate days with Giroux in Columbia in the 1930s, when they were student editors of a poetry magazine, and then thinking about their various experiences, and of course now at the end of the poem thinking about the Vietnam War. So there's so much going on in there. I think really it's a lovely piece. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. I fell on that one too, and I love that whole thing about the adventure of art. There's lots of great stuff. One of my own favourites is one he wrote to Bill Meredith in 63, and it ends, just come by again. I'm warring with Henry. We're both losing our love.
Sometimes it's those little things. One of my favorite things that Berryman ever wrote is a tiny fragment, which I came across in the archives, 20 years ago. And it simply reads, detached, involved, Henry sang. Detached, involved. And it's that sense of being kind of detached from the world at times, but also deeply involved and deeply committed to it. These are the two kind of poles, I think, within which his work operates.
So that's Philip Coleman talking about selected letters of John Berryman, edited by Philip Coleman and Callista McRae, published by Harvard University Press. So, Philip, we come to the second part of the proceedings, if you like, and that's what we call the toaster challenge, where our guests are given the length of time it takes to make a slice of toast to talk about a book that has meant something to them. So I'm going to count you down into that, and we're going to put the bread in the toaster and put it down. 1, 2, 3, and off you go.
Thy various works, imperial queen, we see, how bright their forms, how decked with pomp by thee. Thy wondrous acts in beauteous order stand, and all attest how potent is thine hand. These are the opening lines of a poem called On Imagination by the poet Phillis Wheatley, generally acknowledged to be the first African-American poet to publish a book of poems in 1773, when Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was printed in England. On Imagination is the first poem in the recently published anthology African-American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Young for the Library of America. I love the personification in Wheatley's poem of imagination as an imperial queen with a potent hand. Wheatley celebrates the power of poetry, but in her poems she also suggests that art and the imagination may play a role in undoing the so-called peculiar institution of slavery that she and many others before and after her suffered under for centuries, and indeed still suffer under today. Wheatley was taken as a slave when she was a child from what is now Senegal or Gambia. Scholars are actually unsure about her actual origins. She survived the journey across the Atlantic. In 1761, she was sold to a family in Boston who enslaved her and named her after the ship that took her to North America. In her poems, however, as Kevin Young puts it, Wheatley ventures and versifies freedom, starting out with the imagination. Throughout the 1,000 pages or so of this anthology, we encounter again and again the voices of African-American poets who have sought to use poetic form to break the chains of slavery, literal and metaphorical, from the 18th century to the present. The evil of slavery persists as a terrible memory, but also as a recurring nightmare right down to the work of contemporary poets like Roger Reeves, Alison Rollins, Claudia Rankin, and Nicholas Seeley, whose poems demand that we acknowledge the systemic violence that continues to impact the lives of Black Americans to this day. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded a few years ago in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer in the United States. In some ways, however, African-American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, is a book that allows us to listen to the BLM voice and message since before the foundation of the United States at the end of the 18th century. So isn't it time that we really started to pay attention? Now, an anthology can serve all kinds of functions. It can be a useful text in an educational context. But I think they're also great books to have around the house, to dip into when you're waiting for the kettle to boil or indeed for the toaster to pop, right? And most of the poems in this anthology can be read in less than 3 minutes, but their power will stay with you for a lifetime, changing how you see the world and perhaps affecting how you might engage with it. So here's one of my favorite poems, first published in June 1921 in a journal called Crisis by the great American poet and so much else, Langston Hughes. It's also in Kevin Young's anthology. It's called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. That's about two or three slices of toast there, Peter. But
that's great. That's great. I'd say it's not really. No, it's just one well done slice there. But I think, like yourself, Philip. I mean, I'm also a bit of a nut for anthologies, and I think, I mean, African American poetry, 250 years of struggle and song by Kevin Young. I mean, that's I'm definitely going to seek it out. It seems to be kind of extraordinary riches in it from all of the reviews I've seen of it. So I kind of I'm really looking forward to it. I was struck as well. I was reading a review in the New York Times, and it mentioned the essay, kind of famous essay by June Jordan, The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America. And she was describing being a judge for a poetry prize back in the mid-'80s. And she was sifting through the last round of manuscripts. She started to jot down the recurring nouns in the books she was reading, and things like moon, elms, lilac, gully, tundra, 16 different manuscripts of poetry. Not one of them used the term of my own black life. There was all, pump handles, snow geese, but there was nothing about low wages or police shootings or the global events of the era. So that great sense of exclusion or the poetry that was conventionally kind of lauded as being almost like a different planet of experience.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Peter. And I mean, it's so important that this book has been published by the Library of America, in the same way a number of years ago when Elizabeth Bishop's collected poems came out with the Library of America. She was the first female poet to be represented by that institution. And it is an institution. And I think, it's Young is not the first African-American writer to edit for the Library of America. In fact, he edited a volume of Berryman's poems for the Library of America's American Poets Project series a couple of years ago. But this is a really important moment in the story of African American poetic history and critical reception. And this anthology includes so much. I mean, across, from the 18th century, from Phillis Wheatley right up to the present moment. Now, it doesn't include and people might well want to make a case for including things like hip-hop lyrics and rap and so on. These are not really included in the book, and Young addresses this in his introduction. He talks also about blues poetry and jazz poetry, which he said, he has edited 2 anthologies of blues poems and jazz poems where you might find that work. But it does include so much else across so many different traditions and so many different approaches to poetry, from kind of, the very kind of innovative and kind of radical kind of concrete poetry to, writers who are now becoming very well known, especially say Claudia Rankine,
Indeed. So that's a definite recommendation. African American Poetry, 250 years, edited by Kevin Young. And as always, details of both books, the Berryman Letters and this anthology, will be on our website at www.booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. So, Philip, that's great. Thanks for coming in today, and let's hope we sent a few readers towards the work of Berryman and African American poetry.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee, and I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.